And I'll hand over to Daniel Morgan Thomas to introduce our speakers for this evening. Daniel.
Hello, everyone. Thanks all for joining us for a special weekday evening meeting this evening. We're really delighted to have the Jewish Small Communities Network present to us this evening with Ed Horwich and Dr. Toni Griffiths. I'd happily tell you more about both of them, but I suspect they'll tell us a lot more about themselves and their very exciting project. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, I think they'll probably want to take them at the end. But if you put them in the chat during, if you need to go early or anything, then I'll keep an eye on those and read them out. But thanks very much, and I'll hand over to Ed and Toni and ask them to unmute and start their presentations.
Oh, thank you very much, Daniel. Indeed, I'm Ed Horwich, and I'm Chief Executive and Project Leader for Connecting Small Histories. So Chief Executive of Jewish Small Communities Network. Before I get into sort of what JSCN is and what our project has started out to try and do, I just wanted to say just how humbling it's been to see the effect that this project has had on people. So many people who've taken part in it, whether they've taken part as active research volunteers, or they've just contributed their stories, or in fact they've just come along for the ride. They've just been very interested in what's been going on. And we have had sort of many diasporas from around the country involved, whether they are still living in the UK or whether they've gone to America or Israel or even the Caribbean. So we've had a lot of people there. There are two words that we use in Hebrew, kahila and chesed. You probably know what they mean. Kahila means community and chesed means loving kindness. We knew that we were dealing in this project with communities, both past and present, but we didn't realize that our volunteer researchers actually have become a community in themselves, very tight group who really got on in a very friendly way. And so that explains the community part of what I'm talking about. Why chesed? Why loving kindness? Well, we started to write the project, but we never knew that such a thing, I mean, who did? Such a thing as COVID would exist. And of course, we could never have imagined the effect that it would have on people. So to hear in the feedback now, we've got into the closing stages of the project, to hear the feedback from those who've been researchers or participated in other ways, to hear that in some cases Connecting Small Histories has been the thing that got them through COVID, through isolation, through the lockdown. Well, it's just amazing, and it's amazing to feel that loving kindness, that chesed that they have expressed towards us, and as being part of what we've been doing through our enthusiasm to find this footprint of Jewish life. We couldn't have imagined that that would have been one of the major results of the project. So let me tell you what JSCN, what Jewish Small Communities is, and what's behind our, or at least an introduction to Connecting Small Histories. And our project officer, Dr. Toni Griffiths, Toni over there to her friends and to me, is going to come and tell us a bit more detail in a little while. But Jewish Small Communities Network serves 55,000 people living in or proximate to 100 plus small communities over the whole British Isles. That, believe it or not, is 20% of the total Jewish UK population. We're an open door for anybody who needs help with anything to do with small communities, small Jewish communities. We bring communities together to learn and to share from one another. And we support their resilience and their leadership. And we kind of act, somebody described it like this, and I've used it ever since. We act as the missing jigsaw piece between communities and organizations that could actually support them. And what about the project that we're going to be talking about tonight? What about why is it Connecting Small Histories? In the fly page to the project book that we've now produced, I say, you know, that being small is deceptive. It's a bit like, you know, the iceberg. There's a small bit on top and there's a mass underneath, a huge amount of the iceberg underneath. For both the wider non-Jewish community and even the Jewish community itself and its organizations, you know, all the Jewish organizations that we know of, the existence of Jewish life outside places like Manchester and London is now something, well, it's growing, that they find hard to conceive of, that there is Jewish life going on there. You probably know that there is, but so many people do not. And many people do not know that there are so many communities. If I ask people to guess how many small communities are there, well, you know now because I've told you, but if I just ask them out of the blue, even somebody who's lived in a small community, they quite often say, well, there's 6 or 7, and maybe they'll get up to 8. And as a guess, they'll say, well, maybe 15. And then when you say, well, it's actually over 100 in 72 towns, because not all communities share a life, they're really, really surprised. So why would anybody else know that that was the case? What I wanted to do was to try and map that footprint, to create some sort of visual or something that would conjure up in the mind this big footprint that Jewish community has had on this country, to try and get across that fact and that reality, which is still there today, even though many of those communities have shrunk quite a lot. And we decided to do it by recording the histories and memories of those places where there is still community life, or where there is no community life. There used to be some, but is no longer, through those personal stories of people who lived there or used to live there, and how Jewish life has impacted on the local culture and economy in many places that is now being forgotten, if it's not already being forgotten. In 12 months, we couldn't hope to cover the whole country. So we selected 6 locations to represent the scope and diversity of what was out there. We picked the seaside, St Anne's on the Lancashire coast, Eastbourne on the south coast, the countryside, Cumbria up in the north, Somerset down in the southwest, and the former communities, or almost former communities, of Sunderland and Bradford. So as I said, Toni Griffiths is with me tonight and is going to give us some insights into that research. But before we do that, I'd just like to show you a short video which really gives a flavour of how rich Jewish life is around the country in small communities as it's out there today. And I'm just going to share my screen with you.
Please remember to share your system sound, Ed.
Yes. And if I can just get that, that's the right one. Now then, it might kick off and I might just have to make it a bit bigger. Oh, there we go. And now I've got the pleasure of handing over to our project officer, Dr. Toni Griffiths.
Thanks very much, Ed, and good evening, everybody. So the Connecting Small Histories project is a collaboration between the Jewish Small Communities Network and Swansea University. It's funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and originated from the notion that small communities have a shared but distinctive heritage, and this is intimately tied to their size. It relates, of course, to Jewish and non-Jewish communities, but for the members of JSCN in particular, with that size often comes a sense of vulnerability. As synagogues close or are repurposed, a community can lose potential focus for its stories and activities. Also, it's too often true that specifically Jewish voices are often omitted from the presentation of local history and heritage, despite there having been Jewish presence in Britain dating back from the resettlement of the mid-17th century and a preceding medieval history from 1066 to 1290. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me a moment. So, Connecting Small Histories was inspired by the desire, as Ed has already said, to map the extent of the footprint of Jewish communities across Britain and the integration of past or present with local culture and economy. The objective of this project is to document and to celebrate the stories of Jewish life in places where the presence is diminishing, small or even already vanished, and to use those stories to raise awareness among Jewish and non-Jewish locals of the rich heritage that's right on their doorsteps. We believe that the stories from communities which are now either dispersed or in small in number reveal the footprint of Jewish life in these areas of the UK and beyond. And these are integral then to the wider stories of villages, towns and cities in Britain. So together with a group of highly committed volunteers, our team has been lucky enough to explore these hidden pasts and surviving memories from 6 locations that you can see here on the map. In fact, the case study of Bradford was an interesting one, and one that we were talking about just briefly before this evening started. And it gave us the opportunity to look at a different type of community, one that we weren't expecting or even prepared for in bid. And this was mostly because we realised that there has been a lot of work already done on the history and heritage of Jews in Bradford. And so we were given the opportunity to look instead at how the memory of Bradford's Jews are recognised, acknowledged, preserved, and things like this on an online community. So we were looking at social media platforms such as Facebook, where people are sharing stories and photographs of the community in Bradford, and we were able to write about those in the project book that Ed has already mentioned. So we're going to hear now from 2 of our volunteers, Anne Goldstein and Jane Warner, as they talk about the significance of small Jewish communities to them.
But I think when you're in a small community, being actively Jewish requires a lot of effort. So the synagogue that I attend, which isn't a conventional synagogue building, it's a hall. The synagogue is 25 miles from me. And there are other issues as well. So you can't buy Jewish food in the area. Many of my friends, my Jewish friends here, bake their own challah because we don't have Jewish bakers. But I think there's something positive about it because it makes you more resilient and it makes you more determined to sustain your beliefs because it isn't easy sometimes. And I think that spirit of resilience is in the Jewish character and in our history.
So the whole point of the Somerset group, everybody without question was saying, but I thought I was the only person. I thought I was the only Jewish person in Somerset. And then people get talking when they get together and they know somebody who knew somebody or went to school with somebody, or it's just a small world. So, and it's lovely. It's like family, isn't it?
So the Connecting Small Histories project started in April 2020, and it's going to finish in just a few weeks officially, although as these things often have a way of doing, it will continue, albeit more informally. And so having started in April 2020, it was carried on against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the project, we're glad to say, has been successfully adapted to account for government restrictions. And so it's been delivered almost exclusively online, with a small number of in-person interviews when that was safe to do so. So through a combination of training sessions, meetings, and in-depth research, a patchwork of local and individual testimonies have been carefully stitched together and published in our project book and in articles on our Heritage Hub, links of which we will share at the end of the session. Overall, the project has linked these histories to each other, as well as to pre-existing heritage projects and to larger narratives of Jewish history in Britain. We've covered themes of life, creativity, diaspora, and future heritage. These fascinating stories have been researched and shared with wider audiences as part of a series of talks to external organisations, ranging from the NHS chaplaincy in the Southwest to this evening's talk to the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain, also including local SACRE groups and the JW3 as well. Back in March, we also hosted a 10-day history festival, which was recorded, and the videos are now available on our hub alongside articles and interactive Google Maps. But for now, we're going to shine a spotlight on just a few of the stories, the many stories from the Connecting Small Histories project. When Jeremy Topaz emailed in from Israel last year to respond to our call for Sunderland memories, it was the start of a fascinating heritage trail across 3 of our locations that lit up the History Festival. Jeremy himself kindly recorded the story and his own, with the description of his journey from Sunderland to Cumbria, where his father set up a photographic postcard business. Here is Jeremy's story, told in his own words and first shown at the History Festival in March.
I was born in Sunderland in 1931 and lived there until in 1940 the Germans started bombing the town and we moved to Appleby in Cumbria to escape the bombing. But first let me tell a bit about my family. Both my parents were immigrants. My father, Joseph Louis Topaz, was born in Vitebsk in Belarus. When he was 2 years old, his father brought the family to England. Eventually, they settled in Sunderland, and my grandfather opened a furniture factory. My father was studying to become an architect when my grandfather suddenly died, and Dad had to take over management of the factory. He had a partner, one Stanley Goldberg. My mother, Rose Brewer, was born in South Africa. Her father came to Sunderland from Kretinga in Lithuania, as did many of the Jews in Sunderland. He tried his luck for a while in South Africa, but when my mother was 5, they came back to Sunderland. Dad's hobby was photography, especially portraits. He built a studio in the attic of our house and equipped it with sophisticated lighting, which he built himself. He had photos exhibited in various events and was also a member of the Stereo Photographic Club. In 1940, we rented this house in Appleby. At first, Dad continued living in Sunderland, but came to Appleby at the weekends. He showed some of his photos to the local chemist, who was so impressed that he suggested to Dad he set up a studio in Appleby and offered him space in the warehouse behind his shop for the studio and a darkroom. Meanwhile, getting material for furniture production got more and more difficult, and at some point he sold his share of the factory to Goldberg and came to settle in Appleby with us. So he turned his hobby into a profession. There was quite a demand for pictures to send soldiers and distant relatives. At some point, Dad thought he should join the war effort and went to the recruiting office in Carlisle to volunteer for the army, but they told him that photographers were considered an essential service. I went to school in Appleby Grammar School. There was also a school from South Shields, which was evacuated in total to Appleby, and one of the teachers, Arnold Joseph, was Jewish. He lived in Appleby with his wife and daughter. and our families became very friendly, going for walks together in the countryside. There was one other Jewish connection that I know of, a Jewish dentist who had converted to Christianity. We did go to Sunderland for Chagim, holidays, and on some of those occasions the Germans welcomed us with bombs and we had to sit under the stairs as we didn't have a bomb shelter. We also went to Sunderland for my bar mitzvah, but by that time there were no raids. There was a Jewish teacher living in Penrith who helped prepare me for my bar mitzvah, but I lost contact with him. I don't even remember his name. During those years we made quite a lot of trips in the Lake District. Dad always came with a camera. He built up a collection of photos and at some point had the idea of making view postcards for sale, for which there was a great demand. He started by offering them to the local shops and later to other places. I'm very proud of his contribution to tourism in the Lake District. My niece and I have collected between us some 100 of the postcards, and Trish Skinner also has a few more. The studio at the back of the chemist shop was rather hidden, and he decided to move the shop and studio to Penrith, some 12 miles away. He got a shop in Little Dockery in the centre of town, and the adjacent shop for my mother to sell artificial flowers. When the war ended, we had to vacate the house we had rented in Appleby, and we bought a house in Penrith. I transferred to Penrith Queen Elizabeth Grammar School in the 6th form. I heard from some pupils rather nasty anti-Semitic remarks. I soon discovered that the source was the chemistry teacher, who told them things like, the only good thing Hitler did was what he did to the Jews. In my first lesson in his class, he said something against Jews, so I stood up and said, Mr. Hargreaves, you should know that I am Jewish. He never dared to make another remark in that vein, at least not when I was in class. In Penrith there was a Jewish family from Newcastle, the Bursons. Their daughter was older than I and was working for one of the local newspapers. There was a Czech couple who had escaped the Nazis and wanted nothing to do with Jews or Judaism. One more thing, one of our neighbours in Horwich, Miriam Vardy, now deceased, told us that she had spent the war years in Kendal, which is also in Cumbria.
Later on in the History Festival programme, Alan Fell, Senior Consultant for British Jews in the First World War, or the We Were There Too project, presented more information about his fantastic project and its highlights, including the digital archive and interactive website, which will become a permanent record of the lives of Jewish men, women and families 1914 to 1919, with details of their military and home front activities. Their website details can be found on this slide. Part of Alan's talk featured the personal records that are recorded on the site, and he told the audience about Herman Bergson, or Brown, born in 1885 and member of the Bradford Jewish Social Club. Herman served with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces and in 1915 was given a week's leave to marry Margaret Topaz at Spring Gardens Synagogue, Bradford, while suffering from gas poisoning and a wound to the right leg. Herman was sent straight back to the front the day after his wedding. Although Herman was the focus of this story, we were wondering who was Margaret. We recognised the name Topaz. So was she a relation to the story that we just heard about Jeremy? We contacted him and he replied, yes, Margaret. Her name really is Aunt Maggie to us as we knew her. She was one of my father's siblings, 7 sisters and 1 brother. She had 3 children, of whom the last one, Esther, died last month, aged 96. 2 of Esther's children, by the way, were Reform rabbis. The connections, though, did not stop there. Jeremy went on to say that one of Esther's children is Rabbi Walter Rothschild, who just so happened to be an active participant of our History Festival and had tuned in from Berlin and was in the audience. To top it all off, when I was presenting Bella Westlake, one of our volunteers, research on the Bradford History Facebook group, who else but Walter and his siblings appear as children in a photograph of the Boland Street Synagogue. Their grandmother, Margaret Topaz, died in Bradford in 1959, and Herman, who worked as a tailor survived her by nearly 2 decades. Here is a great example of how women can disappear when they change their names on marriage. And here we can see the image in question, the synagogue on Boland Street in around 1967. It shows the synagogue partway through its stone cleaning process as the soot is removed and the beautiful stone from the 1880s is revealed. And there you can see three children stood behind the car, which were the children we were just discussing. As you can see from this shot here, the Topaz family story provided a fantastic trail of connections. More on these stories can be found on our hub, where you can also find interactive maps for each of the locations, including Jeremy's story and the postcards of Whitehaven. And the postcards in particular, I would really suggest that you take a look at because they are such a treat to look through. Another fantastic story is that of Jonathan and Pauline. Pauline was born in 1930. Her parents, Harry and Jeanette, and brother Arnold evacuated to St Anne's from Leeds in 1939. Pauline attended Queen Mary's School where there were other Jewish girls. Her father, Harry, was a special constable during the war years, and her mother, Jeanette, was a volunteer with St John's Ambulance. Pauline remembers being able to see the flashes across the sea where bombs were dropping on Liverpool. She also recalls the US Air Base at Wharton. Her parents, she said, often gave hospitality to the airmen. Pauline and family moved to Blackpool in about 1948. Jonathan's story began in 1936. His parents, Dorothy and Cyril, and baby brother Brian arrived at St Anne's from Manchester in 1940. They lived in a large house called Sandhills on Clifton Drive. They spent a great deal of time riding their bikes and watching the German planes bombing Liverpool and Preston docks. Cyril was a cinema owner who travelled into Manchester daily with other businessmen on what became known as the club train. Jonathan recalls his parents invited several Jewish American servicemen to their home for meals who travelled to the house in a jeep. By the time the war was over, his parents and brother returned to Manchester. There was no room for him to board at Lawrence House at first, so for a few months he was a day boy. Jonathan remembers his parents arranged for him to live with a family called Green. He recalls they were very kind. He was happy, but he couldn't recall their names. So it wasn't long before our project volunteer, Hilary Thomas, had made a connection. She writes, "After speaking with Jonathan, I did some more research and I realised that Pauline's was the family who had given him the home in 1946 and hers was the family whose name he couldn't recall. She spoke with Pauline again in November to ask if she recalled Jonathan, and of course she did. She put him back. Hilary put them both in touch again after 74 years, and the two of them have been in contact over the telephone. Amazingly, they live just 6 miles apart from one another, and the full story was featured in the Jewish Telegraph in November. Our next spotlight is from Eastbourne, and we're going to have a whistle-stop tour of Jewish history in Eastbourne put together by our project volunteer Anne Goldstein.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, let's begin with the Grand Hotel. It was built in 1875 and it's known as the White Palace. It cost £30,000 to construct, and it was built for the upper classes to take their holidays by the sea, taking their staff with them. And it's probably the only 5-star British seaside resort hotel, still with a splendid reputation.
The Grand Hotel on King Edward's Parade was celebrated for its Palm Court String Orchestra, led by Jewish musical directors such as Simon van Leer, Albert Sandler and Leslie Jeffries. You can watch Anne's full presentation on our History Festival page, and we'll be popping links in the chat at the end of the session. The next story is about the first Jewish mayor of Taunton, and his name is Maya Jacobs. This is a story discovered by our volunteer Jane during her research on Somerset and the Southwest.
1, 2,
Oh,
go on.
excuse me.
I started learning about Maya Jacobs from just a little piece of writing from a doctoral thesis by Rabbi Bernard Susser, who said that there was a mayor of Taunton called Maya Jacobs. So I looked into his history and his story. I can maybe show you a picture of him in 1877, where he had become mayor. So Maya Jacobs was born in the late 1820s in Canterbury. He was the oldest of lots of brothers, and he decided he was going to make his way to the Midlands, Worcester and Gloucestershire. And he and one of his brothers, Harry, decided that they were going to sell things. So that was very, very interesting. They were doing furniture making, upholstery, ironmongery, quite a lot of things. And in about 1850, he met a lady in Liverpool, and her name was Matilda Nathan. And here's a picture of her in the 1870s. They married in Ireland, and they came back to live in Taunton, found their way to Taunton. He ran a shop called the Little Dustpan, and he became very, very involved in local politics and trying to make Taunton a more go-ahead, dynamic place. And he succeeded so well that he was made mayor in 1877. And here's a picture of Maya Jacobs with his fellow politicians. Now, it wasn't all plain sailing when he was mayor, and this is what was earth-shattering for me anyway, as a Jewish person living in Taunton. A Reverend Jeremiah Smith said and wrote saying, "We don't want you as mayor because you've not been baptized." And the insults got worse and worse. He was saying that really the committee needed its head examined, because what is the point? He's not a good Christian, not been baptized. He's not therefore worthy of high office. Well, this went on and on. This debate went on and on. Maya was supported 100% by the local people of Taunton, and Also, when it came to the publicity in the Telegraph of the time and the Jewish Chronicle, this became a cause célèbre. And I had no idea that this had happened, no idea whatsoever. And it was just this research that brought it out. And there was even information from America, you know, abroad, talking about this. And the heartwarming thing was that everybody back in the 1870s was on Maya Jacobs' side, that they were very anti this slur on somebody just because of their religion. And that was really heartwarming, especially, you know, we could learn a lesson maybe from the 1870s, really. De Meyer was re-elected a couple of times, and he lived very happily, doing lots of things for Taunton, reincorporating it, getting it going, dynamic, amazing staff. And he lived in a house called Mansfield House, which is off Silver Street, for those of you who know Taunton. Time went on and Matilda passed away, and she was laid to rest in Balls Park Road Cemetery in London. Here is a picture of her grave. And then Meyer got older, his eyesight failed, he became weak and poorly, and he too passed away, and in 1901. Now, he wasn't laid to rest with a Jewish funeral, traditional Jewish funeral, even though some of his nephews attended. His resting place happens to be in the old St. Mary's Cemetery, which, as the people who know Taunton know, it's a bit down from the big Tesco and the college. So I have tried to find his resting place. He was very, very well loved. According to the reports of the time, he was laid to rest by a C of E minister with lots of respect for his religion. But looking at it, because he doesn't actually have a gravestone, there is a marker. Jonathan Romaine, Dr. Jonathan Romaine, who was my rabbi when I was in Maidenhead, says a Jew can be buried anywhere. So they don't have to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. But what's important is that the grave is marked and protected from harm. That's the key thing. And although I have, after 3 attempts, found where his grave is likely to be, there is no grave marker or anything. It's just a patch of grass near some other gravestones. So when I went there last week, I recited Kaddish in the vague area where I think he's laid to rest, and laid a stone where we traditionally put a pebble on a grave. And I think in a way it was sad, it was emotional, and bearing in mind he has done so much for Taunton. He has all but been, apart from this research, all but been forgotten, consigned to nothing, and he deserves better. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
So our last spotlight for this evening is from our very own Ed Horwich, and Ed's going to just take some time now to tell us a bit about his family history and how his story is connected to this project, and in some ways how that was quite unexpected. Okay, thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Toni. That's an amazing story about Maya Jacobs, and we actually had that bit of that doctoral thesis that Jane referred to on the JSCN website. There's so many pages on the JSCN website that I had forgotten that that was there. And Jane said, oh, I came across this bit of research and I can't remember where it was. Maybe it was on the JSCN website, and I looked and it was, and that's where she found it. So even buried in our myths are some gems. But little did I expect that my story was going to feature in our project. That was the last thing on my mind. I hadn't thought about it, but you know, gathering and retelling stories has that knack of roping you in, and it seems to have roped in a little bit of Sephardi history, as well as all those other histories that you've been hearing the snippets of today. Our Connecting Small Histories project, as both of us have referred to, one of the locations was St Anne's, and Hilary, who has been mentioned, Hilary Thomas, was selected to do that research on St Anne's. And I said to her, well, okay, I can tell you a little bit. My family was there for a few years. You know, I can start you off. And then I expected her to just off to go, and she would be, you know, independent, and it was just a little sort of starter. I thought my family history in St Anne's was a simple one, but I'd been collecting a little bit of my family history over the years, really looking to see if I could go back to its roots in Aleppo. Something that I've not achieved, and I don't know whether these days I'll ever achieve any records from Aleppo. But that's where my grandfather, Eli Rachamim Salem, came from, my mother's father. And I knew the history of my family because Lydia Collins had, well, I say written a book, compiled a book, which maybe you know of. It's called The Sephardim of Manchester. It is a compendium of all the family trees of all the Sephardi families who are resident in Manchester. And let me just share my screen because it helps tell the story. So that's this one. Right, hopefully you can see that. There we go. So this is Lydia Collins's book, The Sephardim of Manchester. And on the right-hand side, you can see that it starts off with Isaac Salem, goes to Rachamim Salem, which is a great-grandfather, and then Eli Salem. So my grandfather was Eli Rachamim Salem, born in Aleppo, 1881, thereabouts. And he marries the daughter of Joseph Jeddah, who is Zarifa Jeddah, and that becomes my grandmother. And we all assumed that they had got married in Aleppo. We didn't know when. Had my grandfather come to this country first, and then gone back and got married and then brought over my grandmother, or had they been married in Aleppo and ended up here at some point? All we knew basically was that my grandfather came over as a relatively young man, and like many other Aleppan Jews, was pursuing a career as a cotton merchant. And I don't know whether you've heard of this saying, but there's an Aleppan Syrian saying that says, next year in Manchester. Not next year in Jerusalem, but next year in Manchester, because that was where all the trade was. That was where the Industrial Revolution was, where all the mills were. And so that was the center of the cotton world. Manchester was the center of the cotton world. This was what started off our drive and looking at the history of our family. It's a fax from Lydia Collins to one of my uncles, which then got passed to us, and we were asked to fill in the gaps in a handwritten family tree which she had made at the time. Now then, in this hunt to find out sort of where my grandparents got married, I came across our own Salem, Horwich, Geniza, as it were. I started to use this term in the last few weeks, I have to say. Just it's an affectation, I admit it. But my mother had a folder, a blotter, in which she kept every single wedding invitation, bar mitzvah invitation, postcard that was ever sent to us. And as a young boy, I used to sort of rifle through this, and I was fascinated by it. I didn't know what half the things were, who the people were. But at some point in, I don't know, my 20s or something, I'd come across a wedding invitation. I'd looked at it, and I'd seen that my grandparents' names were on there. And I thought, oh, well, it's my parents' wedding invitation. Just quickly dismissed it, put it back in the folder, and didn't think about it again. But then I ended up getting married, and to get married, I needed my parents' ketubah. Could I find it? No, could not find it. No problem. I knew where they got married. They got married in Leamington Road Shul in Blackpool. Phoned up the shul. Have you got a copy of the ketubah? Sorry, we've lost all the records from those years. It was around 1940. It was in fact 1941. But they've lost all those records. Don't worry. The Chief Rabbi's office will have it phoned up. The Chief Rabbi's office, what year? 1941. I'm sorry, we were bombed by the Germans in the war, and we lost all the records for those years. So sorry. So there I am. I'm not Jewish. I can't prove that I'm Jewish. What do I do? Well, of course, you look down your mother's line, and I'd come back to this folder looking, trying to find, I'd gone and got the civil marriage certificates for my parents, for my grandparents on both sides. And it was leading me in the direction of the possibility that my grandparents, my mother's parents, got married in this country. So I went back and I looked at this wedding invitation again, and for sure, there it is, you can read it. Mr. Joseph Jeddah, my grandmother's father, requests the pleasure of Salim Sharma. If I remember, I'll come back to who Salim Sharma is a little later on. Requests the pleasure of the company and the marriage of his daughter, Zarife, with Mr. Eli Salem at the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, Moldith Road, which was the converted house, March 24th, 1914, just before the First World War, and afterwards at the Midland Hotel in Manchester, the Grand Midland Hotel, which was the only hotel with a kosher kitchen. And that's where all the grand Jewish weddings, or at least the Sephardi ones, were. Now, I looked at that and I went, wow, fantastic. I know where they got married. A little bit later on, I go back and I look, and it's the RSVP address is Marnwood North Drive, St Anne's-on-Sea. I had no idea why that was there. Why was my great-grandfather in St Anne's? Well, around the early 1900s, what I discovered was St Anne's became the Mecca for Syrian Jews, especially the cotton merchant Syrian Jews. Were there any others? And not only did my grandfather move to this country and my grandmother, but all their extended family and many other Jewish families. In the heyday, the golden era, remember this is the golden era in Syria. There is no oppression. There are Jews helping to run the country. They are wealthy merchants, and but they take the chance, the opportunity to start building businesses in this country. And there is North Drive, South Parade, two of streets where many, many Jewish families lived. And here's the proof. My grandparents Marriage certificate, Elise Salem, bachelor, lives 5 South Parade, St Anne's-on-Sea. And then, much to my amazement, Zarifa Jeddah lives at 9 North Drive, St Anne's-on-Sea. So there's the proof, and it tells you what they're doing. My grandfather's a cotton merchant. And there they are, my grandmother and grandfather, a little later than the wedding day. And there's their ketubah. I have to say the illustration is not from the time, but that is the original ketubah, which was safely housed in, well, the Moldith Road Synagogue wasn't there anymore, but all those records have been taken over by the Queen's Road Shari Haim Sephardi Synagogue in Didsbury in South Manchester, and that's where the ketubah was, and that's how I managed to prove and get myself married. And I said that lots of families came over, and the extended family came over. They came over, and many of them, and this is my grandmother's brother and his family, and set up house, as you can see, 66 Parsonage Road in Withington, which is also in South Manchester, very near to, next door to Didsbury. And there he is with his family, and typical for the time, they had live-in servants. So that was nothing unusual for that time. So we have my grandmother, who is, maiden name is Zarifa Jeddah. Her mother was Sarah Jeddah, but her maiden name was Addis. And I don't know how distant the family relationship is to the Addis synagogue in Jerusalem, but obviously part of the extended Addis family. And this is the synagogue, very beautiful synagogue for Aleppan Jews in Jerusalem. And you can see that the contacts going back and forth between Syria and Manchester are quite extensive. I mean, my family's connections, Joseph Jeddah is part of a company which has been built up, and then it got dissolved and changed. They were forever changing businesses when circumstances dictated, so that the trade was going one way or going another, or partners left, or partners did different things. And so you have Yontef Jeddah, who is trying to remember, I think, an uncle of my grandmother, the Patesh family, and there you have the Addis family, Isaac Addis. And this is in the London Gazette, which is where all the notices of company formations and dissolutions are made. So this is in 1897. So you can see the connection goes back quite a way. And there is my great-grandmother, Sarah Addis, and my grandmother as a young lady. Now, the community in St Anne's, there was quite a number of Jewish families there. I've heard said there was 50 Jewish families. I'm not sure if there were 50 families, but that's what it said. And they were organized by a gentleman called Joseph Shmuha. Joseph Shmuha had come over from Baghdad, and he had to enter the banking world. He worked, I think it was for Barclays Bank. And if any of you have heard the talk by Richard Shmuha, you'll know a lot of the detail of this, but I'll briefly give it to you. He worked for Barclays Bank, rose very rapidly, and by the age of 36, he decided to retire. And when he retired, it was the outbreak of the Second World War, and he offered his services to the British government. But in the meantime, he had been the macha for the Jewish community in St Anne's, the Sephardi community as it was then. And he organized the services for Shabbos and for the festivals. He organized the delivery of kosher food, and a number of other gentlemen performed the services, and they davened with the gabbai and with the treasurer and so forth. But he was the one who pulled it all together. But like I say, during the First World War, he went off and worked for the British government, and he traveled the world on their behalf. And one of the places he traveled to a lot was to Cairo, to Egypt. And there he saw that there was an opportunity in Alexandria, which is the coast where a lot of Cairo residents go to when it's too hot in the summer, that there was in fact a swamp area which was stopping the easy transportation of the railway and the roads between the two cities. And he thought, well, if I can drain that and extend the railway, that will make life a bit better. And because he was a diplomat, he had good relationships with the king, and he suggested this, and the king told him to go ahead. And so he drained the swamp, and it became the opportunity to create a huge urban development, of which you can see in the bottom picture, the start of it, which became Shmuha City. Joseph Shmuha wanted to name it after the king. The king said, no, you must call it Shmuha City. And Richard Shmuha tells the story of, I think it's his uncle or his brother, I can't remember, going through an airport, and there is somebody who is an expat Egyptian, and he looks at the passport and he sees the Shmuha name, and he says, do you know you are named after my football team? Because there is a famous Egyptian football team, Shmuha City. And the retort is, no, did you know that that town is named after my family, after my grandfather? Well, that project began in 1924. It went on for a number of years, but the foundation of it was 1924. In 1926, my grandfather was part of a partnership, and the partnership decided that it needed one end of the anchor to be back in Cairo to organize the shipment of cotton, or to broker the shipment of cotton from the Middle Eastern end. My grandfather was that. And so he and the rest of my family uprooted. They had got married, by the way, and weren't living in St Anne's. They were living in Didsbury in South Manchester, but they uprooted from there and made their home in the middle of Cairo, where I can't remember the name of the actual district now, but made their home in Cairo. And there's my mother, bang in the middle in the white dress, on the back of a camel in front of the pyramids, which is not that far away from where they actually lived. My grandmother is on our right, and my grandfather is on my mother's left, and there's quite a picture. But they were there for the next 12 years, as you can see. And 1936, the needs of the business changed, and they returned to England. This time, as you can see, they came back on the Derbyshire. And there it is. And they came back not to Didsbury, but they went back this time to St Anne's, as a community which was very different. It was now a community which had an Ashkenazi, a very active Ashkenazi community, an embryonic synagogue. Under Joseph Shmuha, the services had always been conducted in halls and in people's homes, but now there was the start of a synagogue. They'd taken over, I think it was a rather rickety church, and made that a synagogue at the time. And there's my mother walking in St Anne's town centre in 1939, probably around about the time she was introduced to my father. And there is, I don't think I've got it on the slide here. Oh, yes, I do. There's my mother and father. And there's a letter from 1940, early-ish on, when they're engaged. And she's writing about the war. And as you heard when Toni was talking about the stories of St Anne's evacuees, and of course the Jewish community in St Anne's swelled enormously, evacuees from Manchester and other cities going to the rather safer environments of St Anne's. And she's talking about hearing the bombs falling and hearing the planes going over. Probably not on St Anne's itself, but maybe on Preston Docks. And there she lived until she got married, but my family remained resident in St Anne's, and there's my grandmother, and she retained her Syrian passport until the day she died. So that's a very compacted story of my family history, but a little bit of which features in the book that we wrote, and never did I expect to be featured in that book, but there it is. And now I'm going to hand back to Toni, I think, for a couple of words, and then any questions, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So here you can see just a little snapshot of the book, and the link is there for you to be able to download for free, thanks to the funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Alongside this project book, we also, just a whistle-stop tour, created a school resource, and this is the Heritage Detectives. We've got our characters here, Sam and Sarah, who were curated to encourage Key Stage 2 pupils, but other ages obviously are welcome, to link broader themes of general heritage and diversity to their locations and experiences. So the book has been professionally designed and includes short case studies from the project, as well as snippets from images from our volunteers' research. Retired school teacher and Girl Guides leader Sally Strauss says that this excellent workbook uses examples of Jewish heritage to encourage pupils to explore their own heritage, inspires them to not only look around their local area, but to think about the importance of community and learn more about their own family background. And never has there been a more important time to do that. In addition, we also have an educator guidance page where homeschoolers, teachers, children's groups and others can have more fun further unpacking these themes around heritage, along with useful websites and things like this. So here's just a little overview quickly of our Heritage Hub. And again, we invite you all to have a look around. As Ed says, there's so much on the JSCN website, but the main cusp of what the project is all about is on this Heritage Hub, which we are still adding to in these closing weeks. So yes, please do take a look. And that is everything from me.
I'm just going to add that the Heritage Hub is destined to have a life after the end of the project itself. So the Heritage Hub is going to be curated, and as we find additional Jewish heritage projects, whether they are legacy projects which have not been digitized and they are just sitting on a bookshelf somewhere in an academic library or an ordinary library, we are hoping to bring more content onto there, and the Heritage Fund have charged us with that task, because before now it really hasn't, there's not been one central point to access those things. And we also have a heritage journal in there, again, which will be curated, and our board will be inviting people to write articles and maybe academic papers or proposals which can go on there, or summaries of other projects which they think are of interest. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching our story unfold. It really has been a story, and if you've got any questions, we're open to it.
Thank you very much, Ed. Well, I think we should probably start with our traditional JGSGB round of applause, and thank you all for your wonderful presentations, really, lots of presentations within the one talk. If people have questions, do you either want to, I'll just, so we can all see each other. If you either want to raise your electronic hands, if you can see where they are, or just sort of wave, or if you can't do either of those and you want to put it in the chat, then that's fine too, if you know how to do that. If anyone has any questions. Oh, Sue Wolf, I can see you waving at me. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, it's more comment on Maya Jacobs, who I've been researching on and off for about 15 years. My father had said that we had several mayors in the family at roughly the same time. One of them was the mayor of Taunton. And I found that he was actually a first cousin of my great-grandfather. And there was another mayor in the family, and my great-grandfather's older brother, Daniel Barnard, was the equivalent of the mayor of Chatham at about the same time. And there was quite a custom in the family of being involved in local politics. Maya's father had been on various council committees in Canterbury, as had one or two of his uncles. And it continued for several generations that people were either mayors or married mayors. And in the 20th century, we had 2 or 3 more mayors in the family. But Maya Jacobs is a really lovable character. Everything I've read about him, you warm to him.
Absolutely. Susan, would you mind if I put you in contact with Jane? She would be delighted to talk to you about Maya. In fact, there wasn't time to talk about it this evening, but there's this ongoing joke in the project about Jane and her love affair with Maya Jacobs, because she's absolutely besotted with him as a historical character. You know, she's been referring to him as the other man in her life, she wouldn't mind me saying. And, you know, it's just been an absolute joy for her, particularly during lockdown, and she's been learning new research skills and things like this. But to have, you know, Maya as her central point has just been, it's been really great. And we are, there have been sort of vague conversations with the possibility of a plaque to do with Maya. So if we could put you in contact, I'm sure she'd be thrilled to chat with you.
Yeah, and Susan, if you feel inclined, we would love to include anything you would like to write on the Heritage Journal about that, if you feel like it.
Another connection. It's brilliant.
I think Doreen has her hand up.
Hi, thank you very much. The interesting point about Maya Jacobs is the fact that he was the first mayor of the town. So he wasn't just first Jewish mayor, he was actually the first mayor of Taunton.
Yes, and I thought that was the case, but I wasn't sure. Yes. I have to say, I can confirm that.
It was mentioned in the Jewish Chronicle. He was the first mayor of Taunton.
Wow, we've always had it as down as first Jewish mayor. I mean, I'm sure Jane knows that, but yeah, I didn't realise that either. So I just
wanted to mention that.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Doreen.
Anthony, Scott Norman.
Yeah. Well, 2 things actually. It's lovely always to hear of work done in these small communities. I just wanted to put in a word for myself. I was mayor of Elstree and Boreham Wood, 2005 to 6, so I can add to the chain gang. Also, I have a connection with Taunton because I went to Taunton School between 1960 and 1966. So I don't know whether you could say I have a love affair with the town, because I was put there, I was banished there by my parents, and I couldn't wait to leave school. But having said that, it was a lovely town, and I hope still is a lovely town. And it's wonderful to hear there's a Jewish connection, especially as I was a boy at this boarding school, who was the only Jewish boy in a non-conformist Christian school. I would love to have had my Jewish connection there. If only there had been a Jewish connection and a Jewish community that I knew about in the 60s. Was there a Jewish community during the 60s? Something I missed out on?
Well, I'm not sure about whether there was one in the 60s. I mean, as you know, we get everywhere.
Yes.
But Jane did actually sort of, it was sort of Jane, but it was also sort of a vicar who was very interested in the Jewish community. In every speech that he gave, he would talk lovingly about the Jewish community. And at every speech, there would be somebody who put their hand up and said, well, I'm the only Jew in the village. And this happened so often that he said, well, you must all get together, because you're all the only Jew in the village. And Jane had pulled it together. And there is now a Somerset Jewish society and group, which she organises. In fact, they're organising a get together this coming Sunday. So she's in Taunton. Of course, there is Exeter Synagogue a little bit further away, and of course, much further away, you've got Plymouth and.
Yes, of course.
But there were lots of itinerant Jews around, as you will all know, and they did sort of have an influence in lots of places where they spent a bit more time than maybe they spent just traveling. So there were things going on, but
I think you'll probably know it, Ed. It's probably like teaching a grandmother to suck eggs, but I was told by a previous rabbi of mine who gave us lectures in the history of Jews in England, Rabbi Peter Bias, that Jews weren't always rich, even in England. They were poor. They were peddlers. They were traveling salesmen, and this is what brought them to small communities.
There was quite a lot of that.
For one thing, I learnt that they gravitated to port communities like Portsmouth, for example, and Plymouth, because there were say naval places there, and they could, as tailors, they could sew uniforms for the Navy and stuff like that. So it's useful to fit in the social history there.
Well, it's largely that, it's well known. It's the economic trends of different places which drew us. Like I was saying, the cotton merchants from Syria were drawn by the Industrial Revolution to Manchester, and in very large numbers. And similarly, the coal industry up in Newcastle, although we weren't digging coal, we were businessmen around that economic activity, and the same sort of economic activity arose around shipbuilding in Plymouth, and it was the shipbuilding and that halo of economic activity which people, not necessarily sort of traveling itinerant workers, but businessmen would go, and of course there was the itinerant travelers around that, and like you say, sailmakers, so the tailoring skills and things like that. I mean, in the Second World War, there was a lot of tailors, Jewish tailors, who got involved in plane making, because the plane wings, the fuselage for some planes was still fabric, so to make it lighter. So
last thing I wanted to say was actually that I have a Syrian Jewish Aleppo connection, and when I moved to Manchester, where I lived for 5 years until recently, I discovered that too. So you learn something from whatever community you're in at the time in this country.
Well, the Addis family were Habib Addis was one of the founders of the Cheetham Hill Synagogue on Cheetham Hill Road, which is now the Jewish Museum in Manchester. So,
and they got a brand new one now.
Well,
brand new building.
It's an extension.
Yes,
it's an extension.
Yeah. Thanks. Good luck to you.
Thanks for the question and what you told us.
Lovely, thank you, Anthony. Peter Harbron, I can see you put your hand up.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on the last topic of peddlers and ports. I was doing some research for a friend with two families, Mitchells in Plymouth and the Russells in Sheerness, who knew there was a community in Sheerness in the early 19th century. But what was fascinating to find out, again on the naval theme, was that a Henry Russell, born in 1812 in Sheerness, was a composer, and he's best known, believe it or not, for composing A Life on the Ocean Waves.
Oh, wow.
Can I just check you? He's one of my ancestors. I come from the Russell family. So, very interesting, that is.
And you obviously know the story of the Japanese earthquake then?
I don't know if I do, actually.
Oh dear. Well, one of the Russells set up business in Japan, I believe in Yokohama. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you give me, or if I manage to find your email address, I can send you the details. But in the event, there was a very bad earthquake in 1923 in Yokohama, which, I mean, really, really bad earthquake, a bit like the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 or 8. and he lost everything. But he was a very well respected citizen there. He'd gone out earlier, or some years earlier, to set up a trading business. And yeah, that's certainly a Russell.
Just branch it. Sorry, go on, Adrian.
No, I was just going to say the Russells I actually did put a question in the chat asking if you had done any research for Sheerness at all, because that's where a lot of the family went, as has been previously said, because of it was a port, and obviously they could do some sort of business there. But there are lots of tales and stories. I think one of the Russells was on a ship and fell and was killed, and there's lots of stories, but Henry Russell.
The one in Yokohama was called Morris Moses Russell, born 1857. And he had a very successful business, and in a very posh part of Yokohama, I think up on a hill, you know, out of the way of the dirtiness of the city. Anyway.
Unfortunately, Sheerness didn't sort of crop in. I mean, there were lots of peripheral things, and that's where our heritage hub and very much the journal sort of come in, because we had people saying, well, you know, you went to St Anne's, why didn't you go to Southport, where there's lots more documentation and things like that? And people were sort of talking around, and in the northeast, people saying, well, you know, there's not just Sunderland, but you know, there's Whitley Bay, there's South Shields, there's Middlesbrough, there's all these places. And we did have a meeting where we got a lot of that diaspora coming in. So not just the Sunderland, but the whole sort of the northeast diaspora, as it were talking. Unfortunately, that wasn't replicated, you know, sort of anywhere else where around where we did research. But somebody mentioned that, you know, Jews were not always, you know, the wealthier end of the population, and I think that's his truism. That, in fact, not always, but you know, a lot of people, you know, it was the few who were rich rather than the many, and that's, you know, it goes to the old trope, doesn't it? And what Anne Goldstein, who did research on Eastbourne, discovered, well, there were lots of not just Jewish musicians that she referred to, but also lots of Jewish circus performers and people like that. In fact, my daughter, who is in Mallorca at the moment, has just come across a Jewish performer who was working in Cirque du Soleil. So it still happens.
As you said,
policemen, though.
Sorry?
I was going to say very few policemen, though.
We have a few in Manchester.
Thank you, anyway.
Thanks,
Thank you for bringing that up.
Did anyone else have any questions they wanted to ask Ed or Tony? Both? Can't see where I'm looking, if I'm not missing anyone. If not, I just wanted to make a quick plug for what is a joint JGSGB venture, which I know I've mentioned to Tony separately by email, which is the JCR UK website, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and I'm hoping everyone on the call is. But it's a really fantastic resource about all Jewish communities, from very big ones to very tiny ones, and including those that are no longer extant. About some communities, it has the locations and sizes of former synagogues. It has details of cemeteries, that some of which are still used, some which haven't been used for years. It even in some cases has memorial inscriptions and census extracts, all sorts of information about some very small communities, covering actually all of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but with lots of detail on English old communities and new ones and very recent ones. It's a really wonderful website, so I recommend it strongly. I'm sure there won't be too much overlap. It's not very multimedia-y, I think it's safe to say. It's about, I think in that sense, it will be really very different from the site, the hub that the JSCN are going to be having. But it's a really great resource with huge amounts of information on it. So if you are interested in any community, or you see, you know, one of your ancestors is born somewhere unusual like Sheerness or Chichester or Hanley in Potteries, then all of those off the top of my head are things I think are included there. So it's really worth taking a look. And otherwise, I think it just leaves me to say a huge thank you again to Ed and Toni for your presentations, and there are the links in the chat that I'm sure we'll all need to go away and have a look at, and probably bombard Ed and Toni with emails and reminiscences, and hopefully people who watch this recording and weren't able to attend tonight can do the same thing as well. So I hope we can have another large JGSB round of applause, and thanks for Ed and Toni. So thank you all of you, and good night.
Thanks everyone.
Yes, indeed. Thanks very much for coming.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Toni. See you on another JGSGB Zoom soon, everyone. Bye for now. Have a great evening.
Bye.